I love political rhetoric, and I love to hear how people explain different things. So it's not my belief that photographic identification is the 21st century, because it's really from the 18th and 19th century. But I think that it's pretty clear that electronic poll books like this one here, which is from a Minnesota company, is what is the 21st century. And as far as I can tell, there was a conscious decision to vote down or not include the real technological innovation that was possible this year.
So it's still in the 19th century?
Yes, so far.
You say that
and Senator Newman said, as he and I testified together in front of the state government committee, and I have heard him say other times, you could register on election day, but you would need to vote provisionally. I agree with him on that statement. You could register, but your vote would be submitted on a provisional basis. The legislature could eliminate all of the double checks, security checks, and things that are done. But this is the opposite of how we want to be operating our election system in Minnesota. But this kind of disagreement is part of the chaos. Some people call this the chaos amendment, because chaos is what's being talked about. Do you have a system that puts 540,000 provisional ballots into the laps of local election officials the day after a really, really long day, and say, process these voter registration forms, process these ballots? That kind of chaos is the kind of thing that has pushed local election officials to come out very strong so far against this. But there will always be debate and spin, and it's one of the reasons why Governor Carlson, Governor Pawlenty, Governor Dayton have said the same thing over and over and over. If you want to make big radical changes in election law, it should only be done when there's very broad agreement and support. Otherwise, all you have is lawsuits, bitterness, partisanship accusations, back and forth, and chaos is the word that some people use to describe when there's all of that going on. So,
but is the Franken-Coleman recount the reason we're here today?
Absolutely not. There's been a steady drumbeat of opposition to Minnesota's same-day registration for at least a dozen years. So that's long predates the Franken-Coleman race. The advisor who was the most helpful to me in understanding the origins of same-day registration was the GOP Secretary of State, Arlen Erdahl, who's a very strong supporter of election day registration and has already spoken out his opposition to this amendment. So his description of how it happened and how the process came to be was, I think, a very good history that's worth looking into. And one of the real benefits to preserving same-day registration, and this was one of the big debates in Maine, because last year when they tried to remove or get rid of or kill same-day registration in Maine, one of the big debates is that when you have same-day registration, you're exempt from many federal laws that are very, very intrusive. When you don't have provisional ballots, you're not under the provisional ballot provisions of intrusion of the Help America Vote Act. When you have same-day registration, you're exempt from the Motor Voter Act or the National Voter Registration Act, which is very, very onerous and very intrusive. When you are following the general guidelines that Minnesota has now for our military voters, you're in compliance with the Military and Overseas Voters Act or the MOVE Act. But if you begin to require or attempt to require proof of identity or other measures that will inhibit or block voting by our military or other overseas voters, you potentially trigger, again, federal intervention. The provisional voting thing is a good example. If we move to this big new parallel system, you have to have all kinds of notification and lookup and all kinds of ways for voters to track, because typically there are hundreds of thousands of people voting provisionally depending on the state and the circumstance, and the federal government says you must have a system for them to check. And because until all provisional ballots are dealt with, you don't know the outcome of elections unless the election is a blowout, it becomes crucial how these are handled. So Minnesota's same-day registration system, which is considered the first of the modern one, has always been the model. And the upper Midwestern states who have, Idaho is in that group, Montana, Wyoming, all those different states. Part of the reason they went the route that we did was to be able to be exempt from these federal laws. And they're quite thoughtful in their comments about those federal laws.
Senator Thomas only suggested on the Senate floor today that the real intention of photo ID is to go after traditional DFL groups, young people, older people. What do you say when you hear that argument?
Well, I think it sort of misses the point that this is a series of proposals in the constitutional area that, number one, lacks broad bipartisan support, and so any major election law change should not happen in that way. But number two, it attempts to amend the Constitution, which is the state's permanent and most important law, and so that's something that is forever. Number three, the big impacts on military voters, on township voters, these are on absentee voters. I mean, arguably, the use of absentee voting has been most effectively done and organized by the Republican Party. So the big impacts of these requirements that get in the way of absentee and military and township voters, I think it's hard to make these kinds of conversations logical. But what is clear is that the vote on this proposal was on strictly party line basis, and some who were voting for it expressed privately to reporters who then reported that they did not feel like they had a choice in how to express their own concerns. So the proposals themselves will affect all kinds of people. I mean, almost every Minnesotan has used same-day registration at some time in their life or helped their kids who were coming 18. So I think it's very broad who it will affect. But I do think it has been argued on such a narrowly strict partisan basis that it makes all of the independent voters in Minnesota very nervous. Very, very nervous. I think that independent voters are some of the people who have used election day registration and have been very thoughtful about that. But I think independent voters in general are very suspicious when something is strictly a partisan battle. They smell a rat somewhere in that. And that debate will go on, throughout this year.
Mr.
So,
Secretary.
yeah.